Good morning, fifth graders. Today we are going to be working on converting between fractions, decimals, and percents. So we're going to look at a couple of different ways to travel between the two. So the first we're going to look at is going from a fraction to a decimal. In order to do that, you need to divide the numerator, which is our top number, by the denominator, which is our bottom number. So we're going to take 12 divided by 25. So that's going to mean that we're going to get a decimal number just like we were working on the last couple days. So 25 doesn't go into 12, so I'm going to add a decimal. And a 0. So how many times would 25 go into 120? So it's going to go in there 4 times because there's only 4 quarters and $1.20. So we're going to do 4 times 25 is 100. And we subtract. We get 20. We have a remainder, so we need to annex another 0, drop it down. And we get, how many times does 25 go into 200? Or how many quarters are in $2? So that's going to be 8. So 8 times 5 is 40. 8 times 2 is 16, plus 4 is 20. So we have nothing left, so our decimal would be 0.48, or 0 and 48 hundredths. Now let's look at going from a decimal to a percent. So once you have your fraction in decimal form, to put a decimal into a percent form, we multiply by 100 or move our decimal place 2 places to the right. So we're going to move our decimal 2 places. So that means we end up with 32.5%. Now let's go the opposite way. Let's go from a percent to a decimal. So we're starting with 82%. So we have 82. So our decimal would be behind our ones place. And then it says divide by 100 or move our 2 decimal places to the left. So we're going to go 1. We're going to go 1, 2 to the left. So we end up with 0.82 as our decimal. Now we're going to go from a decimal to a fraction. So to go from a decimal to a fraction, we write our decimal over the last digit's place value, then we simplify the fraction. So our last digit is in the 5, and it's in our tenths, hundredths, thousandths place. So that means we're going to put 145 over 1,000. Then we need to simplify. So what number would go both into 145 and 1,000? I'm going to rewrite that so I have more room. So we're going to divide. I know that 5 goes into both of them because they end in a 5 and a 0. So 5 goes into 14 2 times to get 10, and then 5 goes into 45 9 times. And then 1,000 divided by 5 would be 200. So this would be my fraction because 29 is a prime number. and 29 doesn't go into 200. And the last way that we're going to look at converting between fractions, decimals, and percents is going from a fraction to a percent. So first we have to turn the fraction into a decimal. So we have to go back up here, and that tells us to go to divide our numerator by the denominator. So we have to take 3 divided by 8. So we put in our decimal and a 0, move our decimal up to our answer. 8 goes into 30 3 times. 3 times 8 is 24. Subtract, we have a remainder of 6. So that means we annex a 0, drop it down. 8 goes into 60. 7 times 8 is 56. Subtract, we get a 4, so that means we're not quite done. So we annex another 0 and drop it down. 8 goes into 40, 5 times 8 is 40. So we end up with 0.375. But we're not done yet because we need to turn it into a percent. So now we have to go, how do we turn a decimal into a percent? We move our decimal place 2 places to the right. So we move our decimal 1, 2. So we end up with 37.5%. So mainly, you need to know your top 3. Then you should be able to get between any of the fractions, decimals, or percents if you know those top 3 steps. So now I want you to try. I want you to turn 2/5 into a decimal. So remember, you're going to take 2 divided by 5. We annex our decimal and a 0. Move our decimal up into our answer. How many times does 5 go into 20? It goes in there 4 times. So we end up with 0.4 as our decimal. Let's do our decimal to a percent. Turn 1,264 10,000ths into a percent. So we need to move our decimal 2 places to the right. So we go 1, so we go 1, 2. So we end up with 12 and 63 hundredths percent. Now let's look at percent to decimal. So turn 75% into a decimal. So remember, our decimal place always comes after our ones place. Now we need to move our decimal 2 places to the left. 1, 2. So we end up with 75 hundredths. Now let's work and make our decimal to a fraction. So what is 75 hundredths as a percent? Or no, as a fraction. So we're going to take 75 hundredths, so our last place is in the hundredths place, so that means we're going to put 75 over 100. We know that 25 goes into both of these because they're both can be made by quarters. So there's 3 quarters in 75 and 4 quarters in 100. So our fraction would be 3/4. And then our last one, we need to turn our fraction into a percent. So turn 5/6 into a percent. So we take 5 divided by 6. We need to annex a decimal and a 0. Bring a decimal up to the answer. How many times does 6 go into 50? So that would go in there 8 times. 6 times 8 is 48. And we have 2 left over. So we annex another 0, drop it down. How many times does 6 go into 18? It goes in there 20, goes in there 3 times. 6 times 3 is 18. We get 2 again. So that shows us that we're going to have a repeating decimal. So we're just going to leave it at 8.3. And we're going to put our little repeating sign over it. So now we need to take and we need to change our decimal into a percent. So we're going to go and we're going to move our decimal 2 places to the right. So we end up with 83%. So this is the skill we're going to be practicing today and tomorrow. So make sure if you have any questions that you reach out.